Stop scrolling for just a moment, because the quarter in front of you might be far more interesting than its 25-cent face value suggests. Today, we're taking a close look at the Washington Quarter, a coin born during one of the most turbulent economic periods in modern American history. Millions were struck, most disappeared into everyday commerce, and countless examples were worn, scratched, or damaged along the way, but a small number survived in remarkable condition. And that is where the story gets exciting. Could an ordinary-looking quarter hiding in your collection be one of those scarce high-grade survivors that collectors are willing to pay serious money for? Stay with us as we uncover the history, rarity, condition, and surprising auction records that make this forgotten piece of American pocket change worth a second look. Let's get started. First up in the 1982 Washington Quarter dollar, struck at the Philadelphia Mint and identified by the small P mint mark beside Washington's hair ribbon. At first glance, there is nothing about this quarter that screams rarity. It was made for everyday commerce. It carried a face value of just 25 cents, and more than 500 million examples were struck in Philadelphia alone. But 1982 was not an ordinary year in the United States, and the circumstances surrounding these coins created a fascinating condition rarity that collectors still chase today. To understand why some 1982 P quarters can be worth dramatically more than 25 cents, we have to travel back to an America dealing with inflation, unemployment, extraordinarily high interest rates, manufacturing struggles, and a painful recession. The country was entering the second year of Ronald Reagan's presidency, while Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker was pursuing one of the most aggressive anti-inflation campaigns in American monetary history. Interest rates had reached levels that made borrowing extraordinarily expensive, housing and construction were under enormous pressure, factories were struggling, and unemployment was climbing toward levels not seen in decades. At the same time, the government was trying to reshape economic policy through tax cuts, deregulation, and spending changes. In this environment, even a quarter had a practical importance that is easy to overlook today. It was money for parking meters, vending machines, bus fares, laundromats, newspapers, small purchases, and countless everyday transactions. The quarter was not created as a collector's treasure. It was created because the American economy needed dependable circulating money. And that distinction is crucial because the extraordinary value of certain surviving 1982 P quarters did not come from the mint intentionally producing a rare coin. It came later, from survival, preservation, quality, and the scarcity of truly exceptional examples. To appreciate the world into which this quarter was born, picture America in 1982. The optimism of the late 1970s had been replaced by economic anxiety. The United States had spent years struggling with inflation, and the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker had decided that controlling rising prices required a painful monetary tightening. The recession had officially begun in 1981, and the pressure was spreading through industries that depended heavily on credit, especially manufacturing and construction. The federal funds rate had approached 20%, while some borrowing rates climbed even higher. For ordinary families, buying a house could suddenly become an intimidating financial decision. For businesses, borrowing money to expand factories, purchase equipment, or maintain operations became much more expensive. The automobile industry was experiencing serious difficulties, American manufacturing communities were under pressure, and unemployment continued to rise. By the end of 1982, unemployment had reached approximately 10.8%, while inflation had fallen dramatically compared with the levels of the previous years. In other words, the country was paying a substantial short-term economic price in an effort to defeat a long-running inflation problem. President Reagan publicly defended the direction of his economic program while acknowledging the severity of the downturn, and his administration faced the difficult political reality of trying to persuade Americans that economic pain could eventually produce a stronger foundation for growth. Meanwhile, Congress and other political leaders were debating how aggressively the Federal Reserve should continue its fight against inflation. This was an era when economic statistics were not abstract numbers to many Americans. They affected whether someone could find work, afford a mortgage, keep a factory open, or maintain a family business. and circulating coins moved through all of these communities. Every time a cashier handed a customer a quarter in change, that little piece of metal became part of the economic bloodstream of the country. The 1982 P quarter, therefore, represents something larger than its denomination. It is a physical survivor from an America caught between the economic problems of the 1970s and the recovery that would emerge later in the 1980s. The story of the quarter itself reaches much further back. The Washington quarter had first appeared in 1932 as a circulating tribute to George Washington, and the familiar portrait was based on the work of sculptor John Flanagan. By 1982, Americans had been using Washington quarters for half a century, and the design had become one of the most recognizable pieces of American pocket change. The 1982 P example belongs to the copper-nickel-clad era that followed the removal of silver from regular circulating quarters in the mid-1960s. Its composition was a copper core surrounded by an outer layer containing copper and nickel, giving the coin its familiar silvery appearance while avoiding the much higher metal value associated with the earlier silver quarters. The coin weighs approximately 5.67 grams and measures about 24.3 millimeters across, with a reeded edge. On the obverse, Washington faces left beneath the word Liberty, with "In God We Trust" beside his portrait and the date 1982 below. The tiny P identifies Philadelphia as the production facility. This P is historically significant because Philadelphia had traditionally produced coins without a mint mark, but the mint began placing the P on circulating coins in the modern era, and the Washington quarter received the P beginning in 1980. That means the 1982 P quarter belongs to the earliest generation of Philadelphia-marked Washington quarters. On the reverse, the familiar American eagle spreads its wings while holding a bundle of arrows, surrounded by United States of America, EPLUBUSUNUM, and quarter dollar. This was not merely decoration. American coin designs were intended to place national symbols into everyday life, allowing presidents, national mottos, eagles, and representations of American identity to travel from person to person in ordinary transactions. The quarter you are looking at, therefore, combines the legacy of Washington, the artistic work of John Flanagan, and the industrial technology of modern clad coinage. It was a product of a government minting system designed to produce enormous quantities of standardized money quickly, consistently, and economically. Now comes one of the most fascinating parts of the 1982 P story, because the coin's rarity is almost the opposite of what you might expect. Philadelphia struck approximately 500,931,000 Washington quarters dated 1982. That is 500 million coins, an enormous production figure that immediately tells us that the ordinary 1982 P quarter is not rare simply because of its mintage. Millions upon millions entered circulation, passed through cash registers, rode in automobile cup holders, disappeared into household jars, and eventually returned to banks and businesses. Yet 1982 has a special characteristic that changed the survival pattern of high-grade examples. The United States Mint did not issue an official annual uncirculated mint set in 1982. That meant collectors did not have the usual enormous supply of specially packaged uncirculated examples preserved directly from the mint. Instead, collectors seeking pristine 1982 coins had to save rolls, bags, or individual coins from circulation channels and hope that some had escaped contact with other coins. That may sound like a small administrative detail, but in the world of modern coin collecting it can be extremely important. When hundreds of millions of coins are made, collectors often assume that thousands or even millions must have been preserved in perfect condition. But a coin that leaves the press in excellent condition can quickly acquire tiny contact marks when thousands of coins are transporting together. A single scrape across Washington's cheek, a cluster of marks in the open fields, or a dull patch of luster can prevent a coin from receiving the highest grades. Because the 1982 P issue lacked an official mint set release, truly pristine pieces became much harder to locate than the huge mintage might suggest. This is why collectors call certain modern coins condition rarities. The date itself is common, but the very highest quality survivors are scarce. The 1982 P quarter is one of the classic examples of that phenomenon. If you have a 1982 P quarter in your collection, the next question is naturally, how many are actually left today? The honest answer is that nobody can give an exact census of every surviving coin. More than 500 million were originally struck, but the mint did not record every coin's later condition, location, or survival. Many were spent, lost, damaged, melted indirectly through normal metal recycling, or simply disappeared into private collections. Next up to in the 1985 P Washington quarter, struck at the Philadelphia Mint and carrying the P Mint mark. And before we decide whether this coin is truly rare or valuable, we need to travel back to the America that produced it. In 1985, the country was living through a period of enormous change. The Cold War was still shaping international politics. Ronald Reagan was president. The American economy was recovering from the severe recession of the early 1980s. Inflation had fallen dramatically from the painful levels of the previous decade, and millions of Americans were adjusting to a new economic environment built around technology, consumer spending, financial markets, and increasingly global competition. The year itself had an atmosphere that feels remarkably different from today. Personal computers were becoming more visible in homes and offices, cable television was expanding, popular culture was being transformed by MTV and blockbuster movies, and the first generation raised in the post-war era was now reaching middle age. Yet underneath this modernizing America was an enormous everyday economy in which coins still mattered. People used quarters for parking meters, vending machines, laundromats, telephones, public transportation, convenience purchases, and countless other small transactions. The quarter was not a ceremonial object sitting inside a collection album, it was working money. And that is one of the most important things to understand about the 1985 P quarter. The Philadelphia Mint did not manufacture these coins because collectors were waiting for a scarce treasure. It manufactured them because the American economy needed enormous quantities of dependable 25-cent pieces. The official mintage for the 1985 P issue reached 775,818,962 coins, an extraordinary production figure that immediately tells us this was a major circulation issue rather than a deliberately scarce coin. To understand why this particular design existed in the first place, we have to go back much farther than 1985, because the Washington quarter was born from a national desire to honor George Washington. The first Washington quarters appeared in 1932 as part of the celebration surrounding the bicentennial of Washington's birth. What began as a commemorative concept became a permanent part of American coinage, and the design created by sculptor John Flanagan eventually became one of the most recognizable images in American daily life. Washington's portrait faces left on the obverse, while the reverse presents a powerful eagle with wings spread above a bundle of arrows and an olive branch. By 1985, Americans had already been seeing versions of this design for more than 5 decades. But the coin of 1985 was very different in composition from the original Washington quarters of the 1930s and 1940s. The classic Washington quarters struck from 1932 through 1964 were made from 90% silver, but rising silver prices and the changing economics of coin production led the mint to adopt a copper-nickel clad composition for regular quarters beginning in 1965. The 1985 P quarter, therefore, belonged to the modern clad era. Its outer layers were composed of a copper-nickel alloy surrounding a pure copper core, giving the coin its familiar silvery appearance while dramatically reducing the amount of valuable metal contained within it. The standard piece weighs approximately 5.67 grams, measures about 24.3 millimeters across, and has a reeded edge. The P mint mark is particularly important because Philadelphia had traditionally produced coins without a mint mark, but beginning in 1980, circulating quarters produced there carried the P designation. That means the tiny letter beside Washington's portrait is not just decoration. It identifies the facility responsible for producing this enormous 1985 issue. Now picture the United States in 1985 as these quarters were being manufactured and released into circulation. Ronald Reagan was in the White House, and the political atmosphere was deeply influenced by the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Reagan's administration promoted a strong national defense policy and a philosophy emphasizing lower taxes, private investment, and a smaller role for government in certain areas of the economy. At the same time, America was experiencing a substantial economic transformation. The devastating recession that had marked the beginning of the decade had passed, unemployment was falling, and economic activity was expanding. Interest rates, which had reached extraordinary levels earlier in the decade, were coming down, while inflation was far more manageable than it had been during the 1970s. Yet the recovery was not equally comfortable for everyone. Some traditional industrial regions were struggling with factory closures and intense foreign competition, while newer industries, especially technology and finance, were growing rapidly. This was the America in which the 1985 P-quarter entered circulation. A quarter could travel through a grocery store register in one city, a vending machine in another, and a parking meter somewhere else within days. It might be placed in a child's pocket, dropped under a car seat, stored in a cash drawer, or eventually thrown into a jar at home. Millions of these coins experienced exactly that kind of ordinary life. That is why the survival story of the 1985 P-quarter is so interesting. The United States Mint produced hundreds of millions, but the vast majority were never preserved with the care that collectors today would wish they had received. They were spending money, not museum objects, and every time one was rubbed against another coin, scraped against a machine, exposed to moisture, or thrown into a pocket with keys and other metal objects, its potential collector value could decline. In other words, the great mystery surrounding the 1985 P-quarter is not why so many were produced. It is why finding one that escaped decades of ordinary use can be surprisingly difficult. This brings us to the most important distinction in the entire story. The 1985 P Washington quarter is not generally a rare coin in circulated condition simply because it is dated 1985. In fact, calling every 1985 P quarter an ultra-rare coin would be misleading. Its huge mintage makes ordinary examples common, and professional rarity estimates reinforce that point. PCGS currently estimates roughly 271.5 million surviving examples across all grades, around 81.5 million in grades of 60 or better, and approximately 16.3 million at 65 or better. Those figures are estimates rather than a literal census of every surviving coin, because nobody knows the location of every 1985 P-quarter in America or around the world. But they provide a useful picture. There are still enormous numbers of these coins. The fascinating part begins much higher on the grading scale. As preservation approaches the finest mint state levels, the population becomes dramatically smaller. PCGS describes the issue as scarce in MS66 and higher, with fewer than a couple hundred examples found in MS66 and only a small number reaching MS67, with none graded higher in its cited condition census. This is where a common coin can become an uncommon collectible. Imagine two quarters struck in the same year at the same mint, with the same design and composition. One spends 20 years circulating and develops scratches, contact marks, dull surfaces, and wear on Washington's hair and the eagle's feathers. It may be worth little more than face value. The other somehow leaves the mint with excellent surfaces, avoids harsh contact, remains sharply struck, and spends decades protected in an album, roll, or collection. Suddenly, the two coins that began life as identical pieces of money have completely different numismatic identities. The rarity is not necessarily the date alone. The rarity can be the condition. And this is where the 1985 P-quarter becomes especially exciting for anyone searching through old change. When you examine one, do not simply look at the date and the P-mint mark and immediately assume you have discovered a fortune. Instead, study the coin carefully. Look at Washington's cheek, jaw, neck, hair, and the open fields surrounding his portrait. Those broad areas can reveal contact marks very easily. Turn the coin over and inspect the eagle, the lettering, the feathers, and the fields around the reverse. A truly exceptional example should have unusually clean surfaces for its age, strong luster, and an attractive overall appearance. Natural tunning can also be interesting, especially when it develops gradually without evidence of artificial treatment. What you want to avoid is a coin that has been aggressively polished or chemically cleaned in an attempt to make it appear newer. Cleaning can leave hairline scratches and unnatural surfaces, and professional graders can recognize these problems. At the same time, collectors should remain alert for genuine mint errors. The 1985 P issue is known to appear in dramatic error varieties, including off-center strikes, double strikes, missing clad layers, and other unusual minting events that can transform an otherwise common date into a much more desirable collectible. Recent auction records illustrate how dramatically the market can change when a 1985 P quarter possesses a genuine error. Next up in the 1990 P Washington quarter, struck at the Philadelphia Mint with a mintage of 613,792,000 pieces. At first glance, that enormous production number seems to eliminate any possibility of rarity, and in ordinary circulated condition, that is largely true. But the fascinating world of coin collecting is not simply about how many coins were manufactured. It is about how many survived in exceptional condition, how well they were struck, whether they escaped the damage of everyday commerce, and whether a particular example possesses an unusual characteristic that collectors are willing to pay a premium to obtain. The 1990 P quarter takes us directly into the final years of the Cold War, an America experiencing technological transformation, changing economic expectations, political transition, and a rapidly shifting world order. When this quarter entered circulation, George H.W. Bush was president, the Soviet Union was beginning to unravel, the Berlin Wall had recently fallen, and Americans were watching the world move toward an uncertain new chapter. The coin itself was not created as a rare treasure. It was created for something much more practical: commerce. Millions of Americans needed quarters every day for vending machines, laundromats, parking meters, telephones, transportation, shopping, and countless small transactions. Yet decades later, collectors began looking at surviving examples differently. Suddenly, the difference between an ordinary quarter and an extraordinary one could be enormous. To understand why this coin existed at all, we have to travel much further back than 1990. The Washington quarter began in 1932 as a commemorative issue connected with the bicentennial anniversary of George Washington's birth, and the design became a permanent part of American coinage. John Flanagan's portrait of Washington appeared on the obverse, while the reverse carried the American eagle and surrounding inscriptions. For generations, Americans became accustomed to seeing Washington's face whenever they reached into a pocket or opened a cash register. The quarter was more than a denomination. It became part of the physical language of everyday American life. Before 1965, Washington quarters were struck in 90% silver, but rising silver prices and changing monetary conditions forced the United States Mint to move to a copper-nickel-clad composition. By 1990, the standard quarter consisted of an outer layer containing 75% copper and 25% nickel surrounding a pure copper center, with a diameter of 24.3 millimeters and a weight of 5.67 grams. That change was extremely important because it reflected a broader economic reality. The government needed a durable circulating coin that could be produced in enormous quantities without relying on precious metal. By the time the 1990 P quarter was made, the clad Washington quarter had already become a familiar symbol of modern American commerce. The Philadelphia Mint was therefore not producing a collectible rarity when it struck these coins. It was manufacturing a workhorse of the economy. The little quarter had to survive machines, pockets, purses, cash drawers, vending equipment, highways, stores, restaurants, banks, and millions of hands. Its purpose was not to sit safely inside a protective holder. Its purpose was to move. And the America receiving those quarters in 1990 was undergoing a remarkable transformation. The decade of the 1980s had ended with Ronald Reagan's presidency behind it and George H.W. Bush now leading the country. The political atmosphere was shaped by questions about the future of the Cold War, the role of government, federal spending, taxation, international competition, and America's position in a rapidly changing world. Berlin Wall had fallen in November 1989, an event that dramatically symbolized the weakening of communist governments across Eastern Europe. In 1990, Germany was moving toward reunification, while the Soviet Union itself faced enormous political and economic pressure. The United States was therefore minting an everyday quarter during a period when the geopolitical structure that had dominated American foreign policy for decades was beginning to disappear. At home, however, life was not simply a story of political triumph. The American economy was entering a difficult period. Economic growth weakened, unemployment pressures increased, and the country moved toward the recession that became officially recognized in the early 1990s. Americans were dealing with changing industries, financial uncertainty, and the consequences of the economic expansion and imbalances of the previous decade. Meanwhile, technology was transforming daily life. Personal computers were becoming increasingly important, telecommunications were developing rapidly, and businesses were beginning to imagine a future in which information could move faster than ever before. Yet through all this change, the quarter remained stubbornly familiar. A person could be discussing the collapse of the Cold War one moment and feeding a quarter into a vending machine the next. That contrast is one of the most interesting things about this coin. It represents a technologically and politically changing America, while remaining physically almost unchanged in the hand of the average citizen. Now look closely at the coin itself, because the details tell another part of the story. On the obverse is the familiar portrait of George Washington facing left, surrounded by the inscriptions identifying the nation, the denomination, and the motto. The reverse presents the eagle beneath the inscription associated with the United States national identity. The Philadelphia Mint's P mint mark is an important part of identifying this particular issue. By 1990, the P mint mark was no longer unusual. Philadelphia had begun using the P mint mark on circulating quarters in 1980. So the presence of the P does not automatically make the 1990 quarter rare. In fact, the production figure of 613,792,000 tells us something very important. This was a heavily produced circulating coin. That means a normal 1990p quarter found in pocket change should not be described as an ultra-rare coin simply because of its date and mint mark. The real story begins when we separate the ordinary examples from the exceptional survivors. A quarter that spent years moving through commerce could acquire scratches, contact marks, dull surfaces, stains, rim damage, and wear across Washington's hair, cheek, and the reverse details. Millions of examples would have been spent repeatedly until they became visibly worn. Other pieces were eventually removed from circulation because of damage or simply disappeared into collections, jars, drawers, and forgotten accumulations. Meanwhile, the best-preserved coins faced a completely different destiny. Some were saved early, perhaps directly from rolls or bags. Avoiding the constant contact that destroys a coin's original surfaces. Those coins became candidates for professional certification, and the highest quality examples began entering a competitive market where a tiny difference in preservation could mean hundreds or even thousands of dollars. This is where the word rare needs to be handled carefully. There is no reliable basis for claiming that only a specific tiny number of all 1990p quarters survive today, because hundreds of millions were produced and countless examples remain unrecorded in private hands. Professional population reports are not a census of every coin in existence. They count certified examples submitted to a particular grading service. PCGS currently records hundreds of certified 1990p examples across its graded population, while NGC also maintains its own census and auction information. Therefore, the honest way to describe the coin is this: the normal 1990p Washington quarter is common, but the finest certified survivors are comparatively scarce. That distinction becomes dramatically clearer at the upper grades. PCGS records the famous 1990p issue with an auction record of $1,625 for an MS-67 example sold in February 2021, and the relevant PCGS listing identifies that grade as having a very small certified population. Even more strikingly, Great Collections reports a 1990p Washington quarter graded PCGS MS-68 with attractive tunning, that sold for $4,443.75, while its archive indicates that examples of this date have sold across a wide range, depending heavily on grade and quality. This is exactly why a collector should never judge a coin only by its face value or by its mintage. A 1990p quarter might be worth little more than its face value in ordinary circulated condition, yet a spectacular certified specimen can enter an entirely different financial category. Current NGC guidance places circulated examples around roughly 30 cents to 85 cents, depending on grade, while its listed guide values rise through the mint state grades and reach about $180 for the highest displayed level in its standard guide. These figures should be treated as market guides rather than guarantees, because actual selling prices depend on certification, appeal, tunning, strike, marks, demand, and the venue where the coin is sold. Next up in the 1993 D Washington quarter, a coin struck at the Denver Mint during a remarkable turning point in American history. More than 645 million of these quarters were produced at Denver, so this is not a coin that became valuable simply because very few were originally made. In fact, the opposite is true. The 1993 D quarter was produced in enormous numbers for everyday commerce. PCGS estimates that hundreds of millions may still survive in some form, while the population becomes dramatically smaller when we move into the highest uncirculated grades. That is where the story changes. The ordinary 1993 D quarter belongs to the world of pocket change, cash registers, vending machines, parking meters, and bank rolls. But the extraordinary 1993 D quarter belongs to the world of condition rarity, professional grading, registry collecting, and competition for coins that escaped the normal wear and damage of everyday American life. To understand this coin properly, we have to travel back to the beginning of 1993, because the quarter was not created as a collectible treasure. It was created to perform a practical job in American society. The United States Mint needed enormous quantities of dependable circulating money, and the quarter was one of the most important denominations in the nation's daily economic machinery. A quarter could pay for a newspaper, help make change at a store, operate a machine, contribute toward a meal, or combine with other coins to make larger purchases. By 1993, the Washington quarter had already been part of American life for more than 60 years. The original Washington quarter had appeared in 1932 as a commemorative-style issue honoring the bicentennial of George Washington's birth, and the design returned as a regular circulating denomination in 1934. The familiar portrait was based on the work of sculptor John Flanagan, whose interpretation of Washington became one of the most recognizable images in American coinage. The 1993 D piece continued that visual tradition, carrying Washington's left-facing portrait on the obverse, the inscriptions Liberty and In God We Trust, and the date 1993. On the reverse was the powerful eagle with outstretched wings, clutching arrows, surrounded by United States of America, EPLUBUSUNUM, and quarter dollar. The coin measured approximately 24.3 millimeters across and weighed 5.67 grams, using the copper-nickel clad composition that had replaced the old silver quarter beginning in 1965. The Denver D Mint mark identified the facility responsible for striking this particular issue. But the year 1993 was much more than a date stamped into metal. It was a year when America was beginning to move from the uncertainties of the late Cold War period into a new political and economic era. Bill Clinton entered the White House in January 1993 after defeating incumbent President George H.W. Bush and independent candidate Ross Perot in the 1992 election. Clinton came into office at a moment when Americans were still feeling the consequences of the recession that had officially ended in 1991. Unemployment had remained elevated, defense-related layoffs were affecting communities after the end of the Cold War, and the savings and loan crisis and earlier financial instability had left their marks on the national economy. According to historical accounts of the period, unemployment reached about 7.5% in 1992 and the new administration entered office with economic concerns at the center of national attention. Clinton's political message repeatedly emphasized jobs, economic growth, fiscal discipline, and opportunity. His administration pursued a budget strategy intended to reduce the federal deficit, while also promoting education, investment, and employment. In August 1993, Congress passed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, a major piece of legislation that raised taxes on high-income Americans while providing tax reductions for many low-income families and businesses. This was a period when the political debate over the proper size and role of government was intense, and Americans were arguing about taxes, spending, healthcare, trade, jobs, and the direction of the post-Cold War economy. And while the political world was changing, the everyday world of ordinary Americans was changing just as rapidly. In 1993, the United States was beginning to experience the technological transformation that would eventually reshape communication, commerce, entertainment, and even the way people collected coins. Personal computers were becoming increasingly important, although they were still far from universal. The internet existed, but it had not yet become the massive consumer network that people would soon take for granted. There were no smartphones, no social media marketplaces, and no instant online coin auctions available in every pocket. If you wanted to sell a rare quarter, you might visit a coin shop, attend a coin show, place an advertisement, contact a dealer, or participate in a traditional auction. The collector community was therefore much more dependent on physical networks of dealers, clubs, publications, and shows. At the same time, America was becoming more economically integrated with the rest of North America. One of the biggest political and economic stories of 1993 was the debate over the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA had been negotiated under the previous administration, but President Clinton supported its ratification while attempting to address concerns over labor and environmental protections. Congress ultimately approved the agreement late in 1993. Internationally, the United States was also dealing with a world that looked very different after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Cold War had ended, but new conflicts and humanitarian crises were emerging, including the continuing war in Bosnia. At home, Americans witnessed dramatic events such as the World Trade Center bombing in February and the standoff at the Branch Davidian compound near Waco. These events formed part of the atmosphere surrounding the production and circulation of the 1993 D quarter. Every one of those quarters was a tiny product of an America undergoing a major transition. Now look closely at the coin itself, because the physical manufacturing story is where the ordinary quarter begins its journey toward possible rarity. At the Denver Mint, industrial coin production involved carefully prepared dies and planchets moving through a highly controlled manufacturing system. The copper-nickel-clad planchet was fed into a coining press, positioned between dies carrying the Washington quarter's designs, and struck with tremendous force. The metal flowed outward under pressure, filling the recessed details of the dies and producing the raised design elements we recognize as the finished quarter. The edge received its familiar reading as part of the process. And each completed coin was inspected as part of the mint's production operation before entering the enormous stream of American commerce. The 1993 D quarter had a reported mintage of 645,476,128 pieces, an astonishing quantity that tells us something important. The standard issue itself is not rare. This is where many modern coin stories become misleading. A coin being several decades old does not automatically make it rare, and a large mintage does not automatically mean every surviving example is common in every condition. The 1993 D quarter demonstrates the difference perfectly. PCGS describes the issue as common in most grades, with examples readily encountered in circulation, but specifically notes that MS-66 and higher pieces become scarce, with MS-67 examples being particularly difficult to locate. In other words, the rarity is not primarily in the date and mint mark, it is in the preservation. A quarter that spent years sliding across cash drawers, rattling inside vending machines, rubbing against other coins, and passing through countless human hands is fundamentally different from a quarter that somehow survived with nearly pristine surfaces. That survival story gives us the most important question of all. How many 1993 D quarters are actually left today? No one can give a precise census of every surviving coin, because there is no master database recording every quarter still sitting in collections, jars, drawers, bank bags, and circulation. However, PCGS provides a survival estimate of roughly 322.7 million examples across all grades, around 96.8 million at MS60 or better, and approximately 19.36 million at MS65 or better. These are estimates rather than a literal count of every surviving coin, but they help illustrate the enormous difference between general survival and elite survival. The numbers become particularly interesting once collectors move above MS65. A coin graded MS66 must possess significantly stronger preservation, and MS67 examples are scarce enough to attract serious attention. That is why a circulated 1993 D quarter may be worth essentially its face value, while a spectacular certified example can be worth hundreds of dollars. Current market data also shows how dramatically the price can rise at the upper end.